All right, Robby, Soave, what's on your radar today?
Well, you're going to like this one, Brianna. So there's a very popular narrative in mainstream and liberal media circles, one that formed in the immediate aftermath of Donald Trump's surprise win in the 2016 presidential election, and then crystallized and became a go-to explanation for everything that goes wrong in the world. It's the fault of misinformation, probably circulated by Russia on social media. Time and time again, outlets like the New York Times, commentators like Rachel Maddow, Democratic political figures like, well, virtually all of them, except maybe Bernie Sanders and a few others in his orbit, all of them have tried to direct our attention to Russia and their shady influence campaigns on Facebook, on Twitter, and elsewhere. Non-right political pundits are obsessed with the idea all our problems can be traced to Russian trolls who are unwittingly retweeted by the naive, gullible masses. Is that a false claim on your Facebook feed? Oh no, what if Russia put it there? Cue the dramatic music, the sinister music. It's laughable, but it's precisely what passes for content on mainstream cable channels, even though the entire notion has been debunked over and over and over again. Well, here is yet another thorough debunking of the Russian interference narrative. Russia's efforts to sway the 2016 U.S. presidential election in Donald Trump's favor by influencing voters on Twitter had no discernible impact whatsoever, according to a new study just published by New York University's Center for Social Media and Politics. Quote, "We find no evidence of a meaningful relationship between exposure to the Russian foreign influence campaigns and changes in attitudes, polarization, or voting behavior," wrote the study's authors. This observation is well supported by a few key findings. So first, just 1% of Twitter users absorbed about 70% of the so-called Russian disinformation, meaning that's a tiny fraction of overall users who encountered actual Russian trolls. These users were overwhelmingly partisan Republicans. There is no reason to think that masses of gullible swing voters who might have voted for Clinton were hoodwinked by Russia and then voted for Trump instead. This finding closely tracks with previous research on the same subject. A 2019 review by Science Magazine found that just 1% of Twitter users were exposed to misinformation, and these tended to be older, extremely partisan users, people who were already voting for Trump, in other words. Another study by the University of Colorado Boulder found that 94% of Twitter users never shared this kind of content at all. The NYU study also replicates a central finding of these earlier reviews of the research, namely that the amount of time, money, and effort Russia spent on influencing social media users was a drop in the bucket compared to what the work being done by the Trump and Clinton campaigns themselves. They spend millions and millions of dollars, as well as the attention being paid to the candidates by U.S. media outlets. Content from news media and U.S. politicians dwarfed the amount of Russian influence content the electorate was exposed to during the 2016 race, noted the study. Now, the Washington Post's Tim Starks highlighted the study's findings in a recent article. The news probably came as a surprise to many readers. Unfortunately, mainstream and liberal consumers of political news have been conditioned to believe that misinformation, often of foreign and Russian origin, is the source of countless modern maladies. But yet again, data tells a different story. As I wrote in my 2021 book, Tech Panic: Why We Shouldn't Fear Facebook in the Future, the fact that the professional pundit class are themselves excessively active on social media probably makes them really susceptible to the idea that everything is Twitter's fault. That's where they spend all their time. They can't imagine people getting their news and information elsewhere or already having their minds made up. But now, in the wake of the Twitter files release, we also have to be cognizant of all the actual misinformation on this topic that has been imposed on us by our own federal government. The Twitter files revealed that the national security apparatus repeatedly warned Twitter that the platform was swarming with Russian-based misinformation. Twitter's content moderators responded saying, "Thanks, we'll look into that," and then concluded the government was actually wrong. But the FBI was so certain, so convinced of nefarious Russian involvement, that they eventually persuaded moderators to censor account after account. And for what? To the extent Russian trolls were active on social media, they clearly aren't making much of a difference. I know that you know that. All the evidence compiled on this subject helps prove that, and even Twitter knew it. Don't let the FBI, some Democratic politicians, and their friends in the media gaslight you into believing otherwise. So this is another study confirming what we have seen time and time again, which actually matches reality, because if you think about it, Donald Trump won the election largely by getting those tens of thousands of Midwest Rust Belt voters, older, union, working class people who might have been Democrats or union supporters or Obama voters, didn't trust Clinton, voted for Trump. He didn't get them because the Russians reached them on Twitter.
Right.
He got them because they listened to the radio.
Right.
They read the newspaper. They watched cable news. All of those outlets, those communications platforms, the campaigns and their advocates and the media are blasting those people with political messages. And you're saying that it's not that, but in the weeds, they might have stumbled across something that then got them.
Yeah, it's
insane.
Like 3% of Americans, first off, are on Twitter to begin with, and something like a smaller fraction of the people on Twitter are responsible for 80% of all tweets. So you basically have a website that's driven by journalists, podcasters, celebrities, and the like, posting content, not regular people, and certainly regular people who aren't journalists who use it as a kind of news aggregator are not getting, to your point, spending all their time on Twitter. Beyond that, as you mentioned, the left was really targeted with this message. The more successful Bernie Sanders was, the more the implication was, or not the implication, the accusation was that it was only because Bernie bros are being hoodwinked by Putin. All of us have gotten that accusation. Putin puppet, Jill Stein, all of this stuff was around in the ether. And it was always clearly a ridiculous excuse to justify Hillary Clinton's own failings. It's ridiculous that we need to have these kinds of reports explaining that when it was obvious as the nose in my face. You had, not only very few people on Twitter, but the rationale went something like, Russians are tweeting that America has a race problem. Russians are tweeting that, black people haven't been treated well in the United States of America. This is confusing black people. Well, what exactly is the confusion there? Russia's saying accurate things about things that are happening in America. It's not confusion. The best way to, even if it were true, even if it were having an impact, the best way to rebut that is to actually have a platform that shows how you're going to make people's lives better, not just blame them for saying something that is an accurate description of what's been going on in the country.
When this whole thing was happening, it was one of the first times I found myself consistently siding. I mean, I'm not in the left of center side, but thinking that leftists were right about, were more right than just liberals who would be closer to my, the liberals would be saying these things, what? This doesn't match what I'm observing at all.
Yeah.
Have you lost your minds?
Yeah. Meanwhile, by the way, there was finally, too late, but eventually some good reporting in the LA Times about the K-Hive, these paid advocates for the establishment Democratic Party that gets very little notice, even though there's a lot of proof and paper trails leading to these folks. There's an account, a user named Brooklyn Dad Defiant, who was linked to that reporting, who kind of postures as your average, as his name says, Brooklyn Dad, but who was pictured with his arms around Kamala Harris, his husband, and it was sincerely actually in Flynn with the administration and doing their bidding. We saw in the Podesta reporting that there was this, concerted interest in reaching out to certain journalists who were, friendly to the Clinton administration, and their names all came out in these emails. And when you were on Twitter at that time, when you were in the kind of media sphere back in 2016, and then you saw the Podesta list, it was very clear, it wasn't a surprise that these were people who had some special relationship with the administration based on their reporting and how frankly unfair they were to Bernie Sanders or any other potential challenger to the anointed Clinton. So I'm glad people are finally coming around, and I'm glad the Twitter files are, helping people to realize that the real relationships that they should be wary about are the ones where the government is campaigning these social media companies and not the idea of Putin's influence from afar.
The more, we've said this before, but the more we see of the Twitter files, the more I really want to say, hold on here. You are seeing some resistance on the part of Twitter. I mean, for doing the Hunter Biden story first is that's the one that makes Twitter look the worst, because they really do. If you look at just that as an isolated incident, they're really quickly folding, or they're doing the bad thing really immediately, and then they do it, and then they try to double down on it and justify it before they admit it was wrong. But now we're seeing all of the time before that where they go, what are you talking about? These aren't Russian accounts. No one is really seeing them. This is not a big deal. And they just keep getting hammered by the government and then threatened with leaks to the media are going to come after them. Politicians are going to come after them. It's really nefarious, and I think it makes you, if you watch that whole thing, you end up a little bit more sympathetic to the position that people like Gil Roth.
Yeah, I think you're right. I'm going to resist framing that Robby goes soft on Twitter.
Thank you.
I think you're right. All right, we'll have more Rising for you right after this.